Hi, everyone. My name is Brian McAllister Grand. I'm the founder and director of Global Ed, and I'm excited to be with you today to talk about research in the field of international education. This is a really exciting and hot topic, of course, in our field. Today, I'm drawing primarily on two publications, one co-authored with Melissa Whatley, International Higher Education Research, The State of the Field, from NAFSA, and another one co-authored with Fiona Hunter, Douglas Proctor, and Hans de Wit on the evolving definitions of internationalization in the Handbook of International Higher Education, second edition. And you can find more information in those publications, and I'll put those in the resources in the course as well. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to talk about some key topics in international education research and looking at international education as a research field. We'll then cover some introductions to frameworks, methodologies, and data sets. And we'll examine kind of what do we know in international education from what the prior research is telling us. And then finally, explore some emerging topics and research networks in the field. So first, to understand international education research, we first need to look at the question of what is research? Because that's a kind of really interesting question that a lot of international educators are looking at today. Research itself has an interesting global and intercultural history itself, and largely a European one. The word research derives from the old French word meaning the act of searching closely. And by the English Revolution, the word research came to mean investigations into things, the habit of making close investigations, meaning that the term itself was closely linked to European science and colonization. I want to return to that big issue and major issue as we've been discussing in this course later on. But for the moment, let's define research as systematic inquiry and analysis. And in this respect, research differs from other practices that are similar. So it differs from practices such as journalism, statistics, or program evaluation. While all four practices derive from inquiry and analysis, research is the only one that is purposely systematic. That is, topics are categorized into areas of inquiry, each one having a history of literature or prior studies on the subjects. Now, rigorous research, especially in quantitative fields, quantitative studies, seeks to be replicable, replicated, or the degree to which a similar study could be conducted under the same or similar conditions, or that a topic could be continuously interrogated. This makes research rigorous, highly structured, and methodical, prompting this quotation from an international education researcher. So Stewart said in 2012, without the elements of measurement, program design with developmental intention, and structured supervision, the developmental outcome of a student study abroad experience is a proverbial crapshoot. Now, Stewart was talking kind of about integrating program design with assessment and program evaluation, but one could say the same about integrating research findings and really building off of those research findings to really understand what a study abroad experience, whether that's an incoming one or an outgoing one or an exchange, what it's really kind of like for the student experience. That's kind of the key question in our field. So, Stewart is talking about this kind of intentionality that we need when integrating methodical research into our program design strategies, and not just focusing on either research or program design, but really kind of the interplay between the two. So again, I want to make this distinction because research is systematic and it's really built around research questions and research methods. And there is a process for understanding what those methods are. We have a lot of things that are called research in our field that may not actually be rigorous research in this sort of way. So we have reporting on international education activities, which might be considered journalism. And journalism, for all its pros, is not always systematic. Statistics, similarly, are usually one-time studies or snapshot studies, and not necessarily part of a rigorous research tradition. And statistics are often exploratory and not based on defined research questions. Research has usually an identified theoretical framework. So researchers are drawing upon or trying to interrogate or even prove theoretical frameworks like critical theory or social identity theory. Again, we have a lot of studies in the field, but many of these are program evaluation studies or case studies. We have a lot of case studies in the field, and these are not necessarily part of systematic research, but could be more thought of as promotional in nature or descriptive. Now, one big question is whether international education is a single research field. In this course, we've talked about international education as a discipline, and my colleague Sora Friedman at the School for International Training argues very persuasively, and I agree that international education is a discipline. It does have an academic research tradition. There are numerous journals devoted to international education and professorships. But I still think that we're still coming together as a research field, and it's not yet quite a single field of research, but rather still a collection of related subfields. And those subfields are beginning to be more drawn together. So subfields like comparative education or comparative and international education, research on international students, research on study abroad, mobility, global higher education, internationalization at home, internationalization of the curriculum, the list goes on. And sometimes there are distinctive journals that are devoted to these topics, and we're starting to kind of draw that really together in an exciting way. And I think it's a great time to be looking at, what are some of the commonalities without ignoring the diversity of perspectives, the diversity of research traditions and approaches. Also looking at where can we kind of draw together our common practices. How can we think of more common data sets and research subjects so that we can start to collaborate more as a field around research. So in the last few years, we've had a really huge rise in professorships, in journals and journal series, in research groups and associations really devoted to international education research, which is really exciting. And the major associations like the NAFSA, Association of International Educators, or the International Association of Universities, the European Association of International Education, and others have really devoted a lot more attention, money, and time to promoting research. So what are some of the big research topics in the field? I'm going to divide up those major research topics into 4 areas, and you can see them here. So I'll divide it up into learning gains and global perspectives, internationalization of institutions and curricula, student and scholar mobility and identity, and critical and meta-analysis. Now, obviously, there's a lot of overlap between those and a lot of sub-areas, but this is where I want to try to draw these together and make some comparisons across these different research traditions and talk about some major research studies in these areas. So let's start with learning gains and global perspectives. What do we know there? What have we found out over the last decade or so in this research area? And it's actually quite a really fascinating amount of research in this area. Overall, we've seen modest gains for students in achieving expanded global perspectives as part of international education programs. For example, Tarrant, Rubin, and Stoner, collecting data from 286 students who took part in a 2011 summer study abroad program, found significant gains in global citizenship awareness for students enrolled in global citizenship courses abroad than those who did not take part of them. However, a possible challenge of this study and other studies like this is that researchers defined global citizenship in fairly narrow terms around environmental sustainability or action regarding environment and natural resources. So that was their definition, their variable of global citizenship outcomes that they kind of narrowed down. And we know that it's much more diverse and complex and nuanced than just environmental action. But that was one way for researchers to kind of narrow down the outcomes so that they could study how students were kind of changing over time, which is really fascinating, but also requires a little bit of the narrowing down of the complexity of what we mean by global citizenship or global learning or global education. So overall, even when the literature shows gains, sometimes that requires a little bit of researcher narrowing of the topic or the outcomes of the variables in order to better understand those processes. And overall, literature shows mixed gains on these types of measures of global perspectives or intercultural competence, especially among students of different socioeconomic backgrounds, majors, careers, or program types. Now, one of the key questions researchers have been asking over the years, and which really motivated a lot of early research in this field, is whether program duration, learning design, or program type influence learning gains. And the answers so far are mixed. Some studies, like the University of Minnesota's Study Abroad for Global Engagement project, or a study by the researcher Josh McCown, found that short-term programs such as faculty-led trips or faculty-led study abroad yielded just as powerful results as medium or long-term study abroad experiences. On the other hand, the Glossary project, headed in the early 2000s by the University of Georgia system, and I'll come back to this study in a bit because it was significant, found that medium-term length programs of around 4 to 8 weeks were optimal for yielding learning outcome gains. Now, this is really interesting because actually there are not that many programs in the field that are this medium-term length of 4 to 8 weeks, except for perhaps some summer programs that span the entire summer. And as we look now in the field at more virtual learning or hybrid programs that might combine on-site with some virtual learning or some medium-term experiences like these 4 to 8 week experiences, it could be really interesting for looking at learning gains, because that's the one area where we found some significance of duration in assessing kind of learning gains around global perspectives or intercultural learning or language learning. Now, a landmark study in this area was directed by Mick Vandenberg and called the Georgetown Consortium Project because it was based at Georgetown University. That research project found some modest, though indirect, gains in intercultural competence, disciplinary learning, and language learning from those who participated in study abroad programs compared to those who did not. The Georgetown Consortium Project also produced a major finding, which is now commonplace in the field. And this is probably our biggest finding overall in international education, that regardless of program duration or program types, programs that are experiential and highly grounded in experiential learning involve active learning, learner intervention, and holistic staff support lead to greater gains and outcomes, as well as satisfaction of students. In other words, as we might expect, programs that are holistically designed and assessed and supported lead to greater learning outcomes. And that's probably the major policy and program impact to come out of the field in the last decade or so. And that's really from studies like the Georgetown study, as well as other major research projects. Facilitated design, kind of really reflecting with students through the experience. This is not rocket science, it's what you might expect. And it's some of the early theories around the field of international education were really based on facilitation, really kind of working with students very closely to reflect on their experience. More recently, researchers have attempted to expand and test out the idea of this facilitation aspect of global learning and intercultural learning. So in a recent article in Frontiers, the journal of Study Abroad, a group of researchers found that increases in students' intercultural learning when a faculty-led experience was paired with a semester-long intercultural competence course prior to departure really led to greater gains, particularly around metacognitive gains. So metacognitive gains would be kind of learning about learning. So how do students really make sense of their learning experiences and put that into an integrative context and connect it to other learning they have throughout their college experience around global and intercultural issues? Those kind of metacognitive gains and connections were greater when there was more preparation and facilitation connecting the experience itself to these kind of preparatory courses and reflective courses. So while early on, researchers in the field were very focused on mobility and the duration of mobility or program type, we've evolved today to focus on global learning more holistically, especially around scaffolding preparatory courses or reflection exercises, on-site support or re-entry to support student learning. And some of those findings are also supported in the literature on international students and scholar adaptation and sense of belonging. Another major area of interest is more easy to define and quantifiable. And that's research questions around degree completion gains in GPA, or credits earned. That is, are students who participate in international education more likely to graduate faster, earn a higher GPA, or earn credits and other quantifiable outcomes than students who did not participate in international education? Many of these types of early studies around these more quantifiable aspects of degree completion suffered from a major problem of not controlling for selection bias. Now, what is selection bias? For those of you who are not familiar with the term selection bias, I'll just walk you through what that means. Basically, it means this in a nutshell. So naturally, students who take part in international education may already be poised for success in these areas. They may come from, as we know in the field, tend to be coming from more elite backgrounds. They tend to be high achieving students. They may have studied abroad previously or traveled a lot through their parents or their families or their prior schooling. So they may be more naturally poised for success by taking part in a study abroad experience. They're self-selecting in a way. And so research didn't really try to be sophisticated enough to control for this aspect. And it's really not possible, if you think about it, to fully control for it, unless we were setting up a really truly experimental study with a control group and the test group, and we were really kind of piloting that and trying to make that actually happen in real life, which no one has really tried to do this. It's impossible to really control for selection bias. So most of the studies are what we would call quasi-experimental. Quasi-experimental refers to not really shifting the actual practice of what we're doing. So researchers are studying what's actually existing. They may try to play around with some of the selection in the programs as they research these programs, but they're not really trying to run a full experiment. They're basically taking what's being offered and researching that. That's called quasi-experimental. And it's impossible in quasi-experimental studies to fully control for these things around selection bias, but researchers can try to employ some tools to control for this. And the major breakthrough in this area was the glossary project mentioned earlier of the early 2010s in the University of Georgia system. The glossary project attempted to control for selection bias and found that students who studied abroad, when compared to those who didn't and taken them along the same kinds of isolated demographics and variables, had some higher gains in time to degree completion, GPA, and other outcomes than those who did not, proving that there may be a true correlation between studying abroad and actually achieving these higher gains, which is really exciting. And you'll see some citations at the bottom of this slide for that glossary study. Now, most recently, researchers who were part of the glossary project are now spearheading the more ambitious CASI project, or the Consortium for the Analysis of Student Success through International Education. This large-scale project uses advanced quantitative measures, such as research subject matching techniques, to control for selection bias. The CASI project has found that study abroad students are 6.2% more likely to graduate in 4 years compared to non-study abroad students in this sample, in this study, and that study abroad participants earn 2.19 more credits than non-study abroad participants. Again, controlling for other variables and demographics and trying to control for selection bias. Also, study abroad participants in the CASI studies have earned a slightly higher GPA than non-study abroad participants after controlling for other factors. In addition, CASI has found that underrepresented minorities demonstrate higher gains on these metrics than students of a majority population. That's a really important finding because, as I mentioned previously, a lot of prior studies showed gains for students, but not for students of different underrepresented groups. And that was a very discouraging finding in prior studies. But the CASI project and the data that they looked at actually found that there were higher gains on these metrics than for students of majority populations. So this is some really exciting research as part of the CASI project. We also have research on career outcomes. So researchers trying to look at different career outcomes. So does a particular major lead to placements in that major, either say in graduate school or for work placements? And so there's a variety of research in that area as well. However, most of this research should still be noted as other research as nuanced or contextual. So a lot of the research that I've cited here is on US student populations in mobility-focused settings around education abroad in a US context. And the effects on underserved and minority populations show, in general, despite the CASI findings, mixed or stratified results. I want to emphasize, too, that it's very important to think of these quantifiable studies as correlational. Researchers are really trying to establish a correlation between education abroad or international education and those learning outcomes and gains in global perspectives, or career outcomes, or GPA. So these are not causal studies, and very few research today can really be thought of as causal. Really, researchers are trying to establish significant correlations. Outcomes are not uniform amongst subpopulations in a lot of these studies. So, for example, Wolniak and Enberg in 2019 found that study abroad participation among a sample of US students was positively related to post-graduation earnings among social science majors, while at the same time, in the same study abroad was negatively related to job commitment amongst business majors. And we might think of all sorts of reasons for this: the job market at the time for business majors, the changing nature of the MBA, or for business, for business degrees, all these kinds of things. But definitely where the outcomes are in many studies are not uniform amongst different subpopulations, which is a really interesting finding. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about another major research area of the field, which is the internationalization of institutions and curricula. And this is one of my passion projects as well. Traditionally, this research area has focused less on student learning and the content of the learning and the outcomes, and more on organizational theory and institutional cultures. As researchers seek to understand how and under what conditions institutions across the world have internationalized. Now, before we look at this research, we first need to define internationalization, which is no easy task, as the definition, as you know from this course, the definition of internationalization is currently under contestation and is being rapidly sort of shifted from the more traditional Jane Knight, John Hudzik definitions of internationalization. Most research on internationalization in the last decade or so, however, was based on this common, dominant, comprehensive internationalization definition developed by organizations such as NAFSA, the American Council on Education, the European Association of International Education, and the American Council on Education. These definitions in the early 2000s were very much focused on outcomes, checklists, and metrics of internationalization, such as basic commitments to international programs, international student supports, and mission statements that included international and global perspectives. So there was a kind of checklist or metric mentality associated with how internationalization was defined by those like John Hudzik and Jane Knight, because although their articles and publications did not necessarily recommend the checklist mentality, it was natural to kind of take pieces of their definitions and develop metrics and checklists based off of some of those kinds of definitions, because that was the way that a kind of process model was thought of in those days. And as you might see, as we kind of think back to the research that we just looked at around student learning and global perspectives, I would argue that there's a gap that emerged that we're now starting to fill between the content of student learning, what students are actually learning and going through in the processes of their movement and learning over time, and this other bucket of research around internationalization, which was very much focused on the process of internationalization in an organizational theory kind of way. How can institutions become more internationalized? And now we're starting to see that connection be made between the student learning pieces on the ground and what institutions are actually doing. And partly that was because internationalization was not well understood. We were still defining internationalization as we were researching it. And so these are very prominent studies on internationalization today that still tend to take a kind of metric approach to gauging the landscape on commitments to international activities, just measured in terms of like mission statements, commitments to international activities in terms of numbers, quantifiable aspects, but not really necessarily looking at what students are actually learning or what it means to internationalize. So the American Council on Education's Mapping Internationalization on U.S. Campuses project, the International Association of Universities Global Survey, and the European Association for International Education's Barometer Studies. So as I mentioned, a variety of frameworks guided most of this research on internationalization of institutions. Jane Knight's process-based definition of internationalization, John Hudzik's definition of comprehensive internationalization, and Betty Leask's definition of internationalization of the curriculum. These three definitions understand internationalization as a gradual process toward greater infusion of international perspectives into existing and ingrained institutional structures. Research, therefore, tends to look at how leaders can shift or alter these structures to create buy-in for internationalization, rather than looking at the content of internationalization itself. And again, there's a disconnect between research on learning gains, which focuses on the content learned, and research on internationalization, which focuses more on the conditions necessary so that learning might occur. For some examples of internationalization research, there's a line of research on stakeholder alignment. In other words, to what degree are different institutional stakeholders, such as faculty, leadership, and staff, aligned on definitions and benefits of internationalization? There's also a line of research focusing particularly on faculty buy-in for internationalization. Now, I want to mention a recent landmark study by Benettoni on internationalization of the curriculum, which, even while taking a metric-based approach, really advances our understanding of that phenomenon by looking at a lot of layers. So there's a lot of sophistication within metric-based studies today that are really exciting, looking at a lot of layers of sophistication, a lot of layers of research design. So this researcher looked at 4 levels of analysis, 12 different dimensions, and 96 indicators looking at internationalization of the curriculum. So there's some really exciting kind of research going on, still under this kind of more metric-based approach. Now, I want to shift now to student and scholar mobility. And this is probably another one of the most exciting and vibrant areas of research today, largely because of researchers who are taking a post-structuralist or post-Marxist based approach to looking at mobility, really interrogating in a post-modern way, what does mobility really mean? Who benefits from mobility? And how do we understand stratification of who and who is not going and benefiting from mobility of students and scholars? So recent research in this area focuses on types of stratification, mobility for what purposes, and a sense of belonging and integration or lack thereof. And some of this research nicely bridges the divide that I was talking about earlier between student learning and the structures, institutional structures. That's where the most exciting research, I think, is at today, that bridge between student learning and institutional structures. We know that there's a gap there. We know that there's a lot to do from a program design perspective, from a strategy perspective, from a sense of belonging perspective to change and alter those structures, but we have to better understand how are the structures kind of impacting or affecting or inhibiting student learning. And so there's a lot of great research coming out today around those areas. For example, in a 2019 study, Zhang, who's cited here, found that although Chinese and domestic students at one Australian university were positive about intercultural integration and diversity and showed learning gains in those areas, institutional structures inhibited high quality interactions among students in the sample. So this, in other words, the students were primed to learn. They were really ready to learn about each other between Chinese and domestic students at this Australian university, but they kept butting up against institutional structures which confused them and didn't allow for that intercultural learning to really happen. So I'd encourage you to take a look at a study like that to kind of think about how we can better alter those institutional structures or better understand them. And then finally, I want to turn to another exciting area of research today, and it's really different from the ones that I described earlier, because it goes back to that original question of what is research? Most research in international education today, as many of you probably know, is really geared at dismantling or challenging dominant empirical scientific research traditions mentioned throughout this lecture. It's really challenging the kind of scientific methodologies of the scientific method that critical internationalization scholars really now consider to be in many ways a scientific regime that's westernized and hegemonic. And so critical internationalization scholars are really challenging that regime. It's a lot to get through critical theory, meta-analysis, and other post-structural methodologies in order to disrupt power imbalances. And so we've looked a little bit in this course around those critical methodologies, really trying to get at methodologies that are more humanistic, more on ground, more realistic, and more critical about the types of voices that are included and not included. That's a great transition over to frameworks and methodologies. What frameworks and methodologies? We've mentioned a lot of them here. I want to point out some ones more specifically. What are the critical theories? What are the theories that we draw from when we're looking at research in the field? And so critical approaches are now, as I said, becoming more and more accepted as mainstream. And of course, we have a lot going on in the United States around the acceptance of critical race theory. So I don't mean to suggest that everyone has accepted this as a methodology, but there is more acceptance in major journals, especially, and in academia around critical race theory, feminist theory. Intersectionality is really being a primary framework to interrogate power structures. And so critical theorists draw upon a variety of critical theory traditions, as well as Foucault and discourse analysis. So you've heard of Michael Foucault, was famous for promoting a kind of real look at power structures through language and texts. And that's one of the most exciting areas of theoretical work in the field. A lot of earlier work in the field also draws upon experiential learning theory. So John Dewey, the Kolb experiential learning cycle, still really important for looking at the kinds of reflection processes in research that we can best understand student learning. And then in the traditional social sciences, contact theory by Gordon Allport is a really important theoretical construct that international education is primarily based on, because contact theory basically said that the more contact between people of different backgrounds, cultures, races, genders, all different types of people contacting and coming into contact leads to less prejudice. That was Allport's famous theory. It's been significantly tested over the years, both in real life and real time, as we know today, and research settings. And so a lot of our theories of international exchange are really based off of a more nuanced view, but still that kind of essential view of contact theory, as well as institutional theories around, or neo-institutional theories around how institutions change over time or can or don't change over time. So what do we know after all this kind of look at the research landscape, what do we know? What can we say confidently about research? As I mentioned, the primary thing we can say is that program design matters. So program design that is really intentional, collaborative, interventionist, holistic, and looks at student development as well as disciplinary learning, the on-the-ground supports, mental health supports, a holistic design, and that's really tightly mapped out and features on the ground or reflective facilitation, leads to more student learning, more better outcomes around intercultural learning, global perspectives, global citizenship understanding, understanding of global problems, language learning. We can confidently say that more integrated program design and more intentional program design leads to those better outcomes. Now, by and large, we can also confidently say from numerous studies that students who participate in international education tend to be more creative, have higher GPAs, graduate faster, and able to think more critically and empathetically, and have, generally speaking, better career outcomes and gains, or more positive career outcomes and gains, or more intentional ones. So we can map and track research findings around creativity, intercultural communication, and global perspectives. And again, more holistic program design involving aspects of learning, including mental health support and student support, lead to better gains, whatever the variable might be, whether it's career outcomes or learning outcomes. But on duration of program, which was an early fixture of the field's research efforts, we have more kind of mixed findings. And again, an interesting finding around medium length term programs that probably should be investigated further. Now, what are some of the gaps and issues? I've mentioned some of the problems with research in the field so far. The first one on this list, I think, is the primary one, and my colleague Melissa Watley and I identified this in our NAFSA study. Much as what is marked as research is not actual research. And I think for some reason, this is maybe you all have thoughts. I'd welcome your comments in the comment box. Why is that the case that in this field, international education, we have more of that kind of tendency to mark things as research that are not actual research? They might be case studies, they might be program evaluation, they might be anecdotal remarks that is somehow kind of remarked as findings or research. Why is that? We don't have as much of that, I would argue, in teacher education, in K-12, schooling, general education. We don't always see that as much. I mean, there is kind of this slippage of what counts as research, of course, in those areas. But I think particularly in international education, maybe because of the nuanced and diverse nature of the research that has been done so far, and the lack of general research training around practitioners who enter this field, and hopefully this course helps a bit with that, where we see a little bit of what's marked as research is not actual systematic research. The other big problem, as I mentioned before, is that we have is selection bias, where we continue to have more controls over selection bias or ways of mitigating the problems around selection bias, but still that issue today. Also, this is not necessarily a problem, but we have some very lively debates, as we know, around the directions, the definitions, the very definitions and boundaries of this field. And still a lot of silos where people doing work in particular areas think of themselves as kind of doing international education. And what Global Ed is really trying to do, and I hope this is helpful, is try to bring all those kind of folks together and develop some more interplay between the different aspects of international education today. And then integration and synthesis of research. We've had so much emphasis on doing more and more research and just growing our research tradition and getting some funding into research and some attention to the research. And those of us working in NAFSA or the Forum on Education Abroad or other associations sometimes feel like we're beating down the doors, trying to get more emphasis on research and less purely on kind of just the practice of international education. and we feel kind of successful that those associations are paying more attention to research today. Now we have the issue of kind of trying to integrate all that, synthesize it, make it accessible to policymakers. And that's what this lecture a little bit is trying to do. What are the major findings? What do we know? What can we say pretty confidently? So we need to do more of that. Finally, I want to talk about some emerging topics, some exciting emerging topics. You probably can guess around some of what those are, and some emerging research groups. So virtualization and virtual exchange. We all know that virtual exchange is one of the more exciting areas of our field today. And organizations like the Stevens Initiative out in Colorado and others have started to put some money into researching the effects of virtual exchange in some really exciting areas in that area. The internationalization of research. What is international education research? Kind of looking more introspectively at our research practices, and as I mentioned, as critical approaches emerge. And can we think of new methodologies? Can we think of really more participatory, inclusive methodologies? Internationalization of faculty, stratification and finance, a real look today at the finances of study abroad and international education, and really interrogating the flows of money and who benefits from those flows of money. And then, of course, one of the biggest topics today is belonging, inclusion, and exclusion. So these are some areas of research, some of which we've already mentioned, some of which, like virtual exchange, I haven't mentioned quite yet. There are a lot of new research groups. I'm highlighting a few here, emerging networks. Just really wanted to shout out my colleagues at the STAR Scholars Network, who have done just a fantastic job of raising the profile of research in this field. The Journal of International Students is their flagship publication, but the STAR Scholars Network also has a variety of other publication series. And the Journal of International Students itself is not just a journal, it's really a network or a platform. And it involves podcasts, and they have special issues, and they have dialogues and lots of other things that come under the framework of this journal. My colleague Melissa Whatley is part of leading up the Critical Internationalization Studies Network, and I want to give a shout out to the amazing work of that network in raising the profile and acceptance of critical approaches to internationalization. The network offers a journal as well. They have publications, they have presentations, they have master classes where you can learn more about critical internationalization studies. Similarly, the Global Collective for Study Abroad Researchers and Administrators, or GC-SARA, is trying to create a network of study abroad administrators looking at more critical approaches to study abroad. And then the Race and Inclusivity in Global Education Network, or RIGEN, based at the University of Edinburgh, but with a lot of collaborators around the world, is another area around decoloniality and critical approaches to internationalization and global education. Those are just some. I could mention more, but those are some of the more recent ones. So thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and please do look at the resources and comment in the comment box. Thank you so much.